Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This video is number 3, and it is over the Industrial Revolution. So you should take a moment to set up your notes to look like these here. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the hearth of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain in the 1840s, maybe a little before then, and it primarily started in the textile industry. Remember, textiles are making clothes. There's a few reasons why Great Britain was the hearth of the Industrial Revolution. First of all, by the 1840s, Great Britain had a gigantic colonial empire around the world, and they were able to bring back wealth and natural resources from these colonies to fuel their industrial production. We also see the inventor Watt design the steam engine, and that dramatically accelerated the pace in which products could be developed. So we start seeing mass-produced products. But when you think about the steam engine, you have to think about how does it run. And a steam engine needs coal to power it. So England was also able to extract coal reserves to power their steam engines. Lastly, we see the rise of railroads in England during this time as well. These are built to transport goods, and remember, things like the railroad and the steam engine and trains, they need coal to power them, and they are built out of iron, so they need iron ore mined to then create these items. So, again, let's kind of think about this spatial analysis of the location of industry. Where is it and why is it there? So first of all, it needs to be located near coal fields. Remember, this is to power steam engines. It also needs to be created near iron ore fields as well, because you need iron to make the railroads, the steam engines, and the trains. You also need industry to be located near ports. This is for shipping in the raw materials from the colonies and shipping out the finished products from Great Britain. So Great Britain is obviously an island, so easy access to oceans, but we also see a huge canal and river system to connect these ports to the inner areas of the country. Lastly, think about these plants: coal mining, cotton spinning, and then the textile plants where the clothing was made were all located close to each other. And this created a manufacturing region in which transportation was easy between kind of the sources that you needed to produce your products. Okay, so let's talk about the diffusion of the Industrial Revolution. We see the diffusion happen into Europe first. So it started off in Great Britain in the 1840s, and then we see the diffusion move through Europe throughout the 1800s. And it's established in places with the same locational criteria, those same site and situation factors that I just talked about that were present in Great Britain. So, we see industry develop in places, excuse me, that are near coal and iron fields. So that's happening here in this middle of the mainland Europe. And then they have to be connected to ports through waterways, so they can easily transport those raw materials to factories and then the goods to the market. So some big places of industry here in Europe was the Rhine-Ruhr Valley here and Germany. So these are major industrial centers when industry first spread into Europe, and they are still major industrial centers in Europe today. I do want to take kind of a side note and talk to you about the impacts of World War II on industry in Europe. So after World War II, the industry in Europe was devastated and destroyed, right? There was just a major war there. So the U.S. created something called the Marshall Plan, in which the United States government funded the rebuilding of infrastructure in Europe. And that's what this graph is depicting here. So this is the Marshall Plan aid money that was given to Europe from 1948 to 1952. And you can see a lot of this money was given to Great Britain and France, but also you see a lot of money here in the Rhine Ruhr Valley, and that's because the industry was recreated basically here. And so we see this region of Europe really as strong as ever after World War II because of this new and updated industrial equipment that was funded by the U.S. government. Okay, so now let's talk about some secondary hearths of the Industrial Revolution. So this is between about the 19th century and the early 1950s. So let's talk about North America. Development of industry was really concentrated in this New England and Great Lakes area in the United States. And again, let's think about the site and situation factors or the locational criteria that are necessary for industry to thrive. So you need rich natural resources. So in the United States, you can see from this map right here up into Canada, there are major deposits of fossil fuels such as natural gas, oil, and coal, right? So these are necessary ingredients for industry. Also, the United States could import resources from its colonies as well. We also see vast transportation networks in the United States and Canada. So things like canals, rivers, and lakes that were then connected with railroad on land. So if you look at this graph right here, it's showing you kind of the intense buildup of railroads throughout the United States from the 1870s to the 1890s, and the miles, the thousands of miles of track that were laid. So in addition to natural resources and transportation networks, we also see a gigantic population here in the United States. So you've got a large labor pool. And lastly, something else that you need to have for industry is capital, right? Investment money. You have to spend a lot of money to build factories and buy and transport raw materials. So we see a lot of wealthy investors here in the United States too. Another secondary hearth is the Soviet Union. The major regions here are this Volga region as well as St. Petersburg. And again, let's think about the things that industry needs to survive, right? The Soviet Union was rich in resources and raw materials, right? So Russia has some of the largest fossil fuel reserves in the world. And we learned about that in our energy notes. So again, Russia has access to things like coal and oil deposits. And then also, you have to think about the government and economy of the Soviet Union. During the kind of communist revolution, we see the communists sponsor major industrialization in the country as a way to kind of prove power and superiority to the West. So to kind of show that communists can make things work as well. So in 1930s, the Volga region, which is right here, became, and it still continues to be, a dominant industrial region. And this region was very heavily protected during World War II, so it didn't suffer much devastation like the places in Europe that we discussed. These are two propaganda posters from the communist Soviet era, and this one says, "The smoke of chimneys is the breath of Soviet Russia," and then this one here says, "Let's speed up Soviet industrialization." So remember, the Soviet Union becomes large in industry because it's rich in natural resources and raw materials. It has large fossil fuel reserves, and the government sponsored kind of this industrialization to prove communism was just as good as capitalism. Okay, East Asia is our next secondary hearth. And really within East Asia, we're just going to talk about Japan. So the Japanese government opened the Japanese economy in 1868. And when this happens, we see rapid industrialization. So prior to this time, Japan was very isolated and did not want to really be in contact or in trade with other areas of the world. But once this economy is opened up for trade, we see huge and rapid industrialization in Japan. Now, Japan is kind of a weird situation because, yes, it's an island, so it has access to ports and can easily access those from wherever it is in the country. However, Japan was really limited in supplies of natural resources, right? It's kind of a small country. So Japan heavily relied on imports of these natural resources. And how does a country import natural resources? Colonization. So we see in the late 1800s, Japan start to colonize Korea, Taiwan, and then even portions of mainland China to fuel this industrialization. Now, you might think of China as a major industrial country. We always see those made in China tags. However, China didn't industrialize until about the 1980s, 1990s. So we're not going to classify China as a secondary hearth of industry. Okay, let's look at global spatial patterns of industry and results. So first of all, there is a global spatial pattern of industrial regions. This map right here is showing you something called the Brandt line, and we're going to continue to talk about the Brandt line. But what it basically is an imaginary line that divides the rich north, or the developed countries, from the poor south, or the developing countries. This was created by geographer Willy Brandt in the 1980s, and it really is kind of used to look at the north-south divide in development. Notice that the three major regions of industry that we just discussed are all in this northern hemisphere industrial zone, which is, again, represented by this Brandt line. Newly industrializing countries, though, which you can see in this map, are found below the Brandt line. So places like China, Brazil, Mexico. But why have these newly industrialized countries grown recently? A lot has been focused on developing these countries with stability in their governments, a switch from primary to secondary jobs, a focus on exports and trading. And a lot of times the products here are kept very cheap and competitive because labor is much less expensive in these places. Okay, so now results of the Industrial Revolution or the diffusion of industry throughout the world. So first of all, we see because of the agricultural revolution, right, we see an increase in population, and then we see workers who are no longer working on the farm to harvest food, move into the city to seek industrial jobs. So because of population growth, a food surplus, we get things like urbanization and industry. Okay, so in addition to urbanization, with an increase in industry, we also see a demand for raw materials, which I've talked about kind of a million times in this video already, as well as, though, the search for new markets. So with demand for raw materials and a search for new markets, we also see a rise in imperialism and colonization throughout the world as well. And that is the Industrial Revolution.